How could people survive harsh Arctic winters in houses made of wood and earth when temperatures dropped tens of degrees below zero? We imagine Viking settlements covered in snow and buffeted by icy winds. But history tells us that these communities not only survived, they thrived. Their secret was not magic, but remarkably effective engineering, where every element of the house, from the foundation to the roof, was part of a unified heat preservation system. It was not just a house, but a well-designed thermal fortress built in harmony with the harsh nature of the north. Watch the video to the end to find out how the Vikings managed to turn the frosty enemy into their ally, and why their homes were warmer than many modern buildings. I will reveal the best-kept secret. The Viking house, the famous Long House, was not just a building, it was a living creature. The Scandinavians, who spent half their lives at sea, transferred the principles of shipbuilding to land, creating a unique architectural form. These houses, which reached lengths of 30 and sometimes 80 meters, had walls curved like the sides of a drakkar. This shape was chosen not for beauty, but to combat the merciless northern winds, allowing air currents to flow around the structure rather than hitting it with full force. The entire life of the community was concentrated under one giant roof. In this huge space, there was no division into rooms in the modern sense. Everyone lived here, the head of the family, his relatives, workers, and even slaves. Such collective living was not only a social necessity, but also an important element of thermoregulation, since dozens of people in one enclosed space generated a significant amount of heat. The Long House, or Langhus, was designed as a single organism, a self-sufficient ark capable of withstanding many months of winter. Its construction was oriented according to the cardinal directions in order to minimize heat loss. The entrances were almost never located on the end walls, which bore the brunt of the elements, but were hidden in long side walls, often with special extensions. The walls of this earthship were massive and multi-layered. The Vikings did not rely solely on wood, which was a valuable resource in the harsh climate, but not the best insulator. They created a complex sandwich of materials, where each layer performed its own function, turning the dwelling into something like a modern thermos. This technology had been refined over centuries and allowed precious heat to be retained inside. The foundation was a strong wooden frame made of vertical posts that supported the entire weight of the massive roof. These posts, often made from solid pine or oak trunks, were dug deep into the ground. The space between them was filled not with thin boards, but with much more effective materials provided by nature itself.
We need more wood for the fire.
The stew is almost ready, Ragnar.
Skål. May your harvests be plentiful.
We would love to hear your opinion. What do you think about this concept of a ship house, where the entire community lives under one roof, like a single crew? Write about it in the comments. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next episodes about technologies of the past. Are you ready to learn the truth about what the Vikings actually used to build their wooden houses? When we hear Viking house, we imagine a log cabin similar to those built in wooded areas. However, in many regions, such as Iceland or Greenland, wood was incredibly scarce. Therefore, the Vikings developed a technology that minimized the use of wood, relying on other, much more accessible materials. The foundation of the house was the frame. This was the only part where wood was indispensable. Strong pillars made of oak, pine, or birch formed the skeleton of the building. This skeleton bore the entire load of the roof and walls. But the walls themselves were not wooden in the sense we are familiar with. They were more like earthen walls, which was the main secret of their thermal efficiency. Before erecting the frame, the Vikings prepared the foundation. They laid out a line of large, flat stones around the perimeter of the future house. This stone belt served two important functions. First, it leveled the ground, and second, more importantly, it insulated the wooden frame from the damp earth, preventing the wood from rotting. Wooden posts were placed on this stone foundation. The space between them was filled with the most important insulation material of the Viking era, turf. Turf, or peat, consisted of layers of earth tightly bound together by grass roots. It was cut into large rectangular blocks, similar to giant bricks. These sod bricks were stacked on top of each other to form incredibly thick walls. The thickness of such a wall at the base could reach 1.5 and sometimes even 2 meters. The wall narrowed towards the top, which gave it additional stability. The blocks were often laid in a herringbone pattern or interlocked to ensure maximum density and no gaps. Such a turf wall had phenomenal thermal insulation properties. The porous structure of the soil, permeated with roots, retained many small air pockets. It was this immovable air that was the best insulator, working on the same principle as modern foam plastic or mineral wool. Turf was a living material. In the spring, the outside of such a wall was covered with grass, which made the house look like a natural hill, blending completely with the landscape. This grass further strengthened the wall, binding the turf blocks with new roots. The house literally became part of the earth.
See how the hillside embraces our home, safe from prying eyes and the winter winds.
How effective do you think this combination of natural materials was compared to modern ones? But what if I told you that fire was not the only source of heat in the house? In the next chapter, we will reveal the secret of living heating used by the Vikings. What I am about to show you was normal for the Vikings, but shocking to modern people. They shared their homes with dozens of animals. This was not a sign of savagery or poverty, but an ingenious engineering solution that saved fuel and allowed them to survive the harshest winters. The longhouse was not just a dwelling for people, it was also a winter barn, and these two functions were inextricably linked. The interior of the house was clearly divided into two areas, living and working. About half, and sometimes more than half, of the house was occupied by stalls for livestock. Cows, sheep, goats, and horses, the main wealth of any Scandinavian family, spent the winter here. The lack of separate buildings for livestock was not a whim, but a well-thought-out survival strategy. The living area and the barn, or FAOPS, were usually separated by a simple wooden partition. This partition was not airtight. It only marked the boundary, but allowed air and heat to circulate freely between the two parts of the house. People and animals actually breathed the same air under the same roof. The secret of this system lay in simple physics. Any large animal, such as a cow, generates a huge amount of heat during its life. A dozen cows in an enclosed space is a complete heating system, operating around the clock and completely free of charge. The heat generated by livestock was as important a resource as firewood or peat. The floor level in the living area of the house was often slightly higher than in the barn. This was done not only for hygiene reasons, to prevent waste from the barn from entering the living area. Warm air from the animals, following the laws of convection, rose and naturally moved to the higher living area of the house, mixing with the heat from the hearth.
The warmth holds well tonight.
It does.
The animals benefited no less from this proximity. In a harsh climate, a separate barn would freeze through, which would lead to the death of the livestock. Being under the same roof as people and receiving some of the heat from the hearth, the animals were reliably protected from the cold. It was a true symbiosis, beneficial to both sides. Of course, such a neighborhood had its drawbacks, the main one being the smell. However, for the people of that era, the smells of livestock were a familiar part of life, and did not cause the same revulsion as they do for modern city dwellers. Warmth and survival were much more important than olfactory comfort. In addition, the constant work of the hearth and the smoke from it partially neutralized the smells. If you think this method is ingenious in its simplicity, like this video. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos about how people survived in the harsh conditions of the Middle Ages. Want to know the secret that allowed the Vikings to stay warm without glass windows? The main enemy of any warm home in the north is not so much the cold as the wind. The wind blows precious heat out through the smallest cracks, creating drafts. The entire architecture of the longhouse was designed for one purpose: to minimize uncontrolled air movement. The first thing that catches the eye when studying longhouses is the almost complete absence of windows. Glass was incredibly rare and luxurious in that era, available only for the construction of churches.
Good. The warmth is welcome.
Ordinary houses were deprived of this source of light. Sometimes tiny slits were made in the walls, but in winter they were tightly plugged with moss, straw, or wooden plugs. Life in such a house took place in constant semi-darkness, which was dispelled only by the fire in the central hearth. This was a conscious sacrifice made for the sake of preserving heat. The Vikings understood that any window was, first and foremost, a hole in the thermal armor of their home, and preferred darkness to cold. Instead of windows for lighting and ventilation, special openings in the roof were sometimes used, but we will discuss them separately. As for entrances, special attention was paid to their design. Doors were the Achilles heel of any dwelling, and the Vikings developed a whole system to neutralize this threat. The doors in longhouses were always very low. A modern person would have to bend down significantly to enter. This design not only forced the entrant to bow to the owners, but also minimized the amount of cold air entering when the door was opened. The low doorway blocked a significant portion of the icy draft. The doors themselves were massive, made of thick planks, and fitted tightly to the jamb. They never hung on the hinges we are used to. Instead, they rotated on powerful wooden pins that fit into grooves in the threshold and upper crossbar. This design ensured maximum fit and no gaps.
Close that door quickly, man. It is freezing out there.
Aye, come, warm yourself by the hearth.
Often, the entrances to the house were not straight. A small vestibule or entrance hall was built in front of the main door. This vestibule served as the first line of defense. A person first entered this unheated room, closed the outer door behind them, and only then opened the second inner door leading to the living area.
Ah, finally warmth. That cold bites hard tonight. Come closer to the fire, my love.
This airlock system, or heat trap, was incredibly effective. It prevented the icy wind from rushing straight into the heated room.
It is so warm by the fire.
While a person was in the vestibule, they had time to shake the snow off themselves. Thus, the cold and moisture remained behind the second barrier. The location of the entrances was also not accidental. They were almost never placed opposite each other to prevent drafts from blowing through the house. Most often, the entrances were located in long walls protected from the prevailing winter winds. Sometimes the entrance was additionally protected by a protruding part of the wall or an earth embankment. Can you imagine what it was like to live in almost complete darkness for months? In the next chapter, we will talk about the heart of the house, the source that provided not only heat, but also the only light. The heart of the longhouse, its sole and main source of life, was the central hearth. Unlike the compact stoves or fireplaces we are used to, the Viking hearth, or langelder, was a long, shallow pit that stretched along the entire central axis of the living area of the house. It could be up to 10 to 15 meters long, which allowed it to heat a huge space.
I remember a winter colder than this, when the fjord froze solid for 3 moons. We hunted the great white bear upon the ice.
This hearth was not just a fire on the floor. Its edges were lined with large stones, which served several functions. First, they prevented the fire from spreading. Second, the stones accumulated a huge amount of heat, and then slowly and evenly released it into the space, acting as a large heating battery. Wood was the main fuel, but in treeless regions such as Iceland, peat was widely used. Peat burned slowly, gave off even heat, and was available in abundance. Harvesting peat for the winter was one of the most important tasks of the community, as survival depended directly on it. The long fire was a multifunctional device. First and foremost, it was a source of heat. Its elongated shape allowed the heat to be distributed evenly throughout the living area. People sat on benches along the walls, and everyone received their share of precious heat from this central heater.
A fine blaze tonight.
It warms the soul as well as the body.
The second most important function of the hearth was light. In a windowless house, the langelder was the only source of illumination. The flickering flames illuminated the faces of people, carved wooden pillars, and wisps of smoke under the ceiling. All life in the house was concentrated in this illuminated space. Of course, the hearth was also the kitchen. Large cauldrons were suspended over the fire on special chains or tripods, in which food was prepared for the whole family. Here they cooked soups, porridges, and roasted meat. The smell of cooking mixed with the smell of smoke and livestock, creating the unique atmosphere of a Viking dwelling. What if I told you that the Vikings did not have chimneys, but they did not suffocate from smoke? The presence of a huge open hearth in the center of the house posed a difficult task for builders. How to remove the products of combustion without losing all the heat? The solution to this problem was as simple and ingenious as the entire design of the house.
The fire is strong tonight.
Aye, keeps the cold spirits away.
Pass the horn, brother.
The brick pipes and chimneys we are familiar with did not exist in those days. Smoke from the long fire rose freely, accumulating under the roof itself. The entire upper space of the house, above human height, was filled with a dense, hot, and acrid layer of smoke. This had an unexpected positive effect. Hot smoke and soot constantly saturated the wooden beams of the roof and rafters. This process, similar to smoking, was an excellent preservative. It killed wood-boring beetles and protected the wood from rotting, significantly extending the life of the structure. Of course, the smoke had to go somewhere. For this purpose, special holes were made at the highest point of the roof, directly above the hearth. These holes, called ljora, served both for ventilation and lighting. It was the only source of daylight in the house, apart from the open door. The ljor was not just a hole in the roof. It had a special design that allowed it to be adjusted. Most often, it was a wooden frame that could be partially or completely covered with a special shield or cover. This cover was controlled by a long pole standing by the hearth. Controlling this damper was a real art. In winter, it was kept almost completely closed, leaving only a small gap. This allowed the thickest smoke to escape, but kept as much warm air inside as possible. The quality of the air had to be sacrificed, which was heavy and saturated with smoke in the house. Do you think it was difficult to maintain this balance between fire and air? But the roof was not only an outlet for smoke, it was also the main shield. In the next chapter, we will learn why Viking roofs were alive. The roof of a longhouse was just as important for retaining heat as its massive walls. It was a complex, multi-layered structure that had to withstand enormous weight, keep out water, and most importantly, retain heat. Like the walls, the roof was living and was built using turf. The roof was based on a strong wooden rafter system. Laths made of thinner poles or boards were laid on these rafters. This wooden decking was the first layer, but on its own it could not protect against rain or cold. The real protection began on top of it. The next and one of the most important layers was waterproofing. The Vikings skillfully used birch bark for this purpose. The bark was carefully removed in large sheets and laid on the wooden decking like tiles, overlapping so that water would run down without getting inside. Birch bark contains natural resins that make it virtually waterproof.
Heave that up here. Make sure it's tight against the last one.
On top of the layer of birch bark, the main insulation was laid, turf. The technology was similar to that used in building walls. 2 or even 3 layers of turf blocks were laid on the roof. This heavy earthen coat could weigh several tons, which required the wooden frame of the house to be incredibly strong. The turf on the roof served several functions at once. First, it was an excellent insulator, which, like the walls, kept the heat inside the house. A thick layer of earth prevented the heat from escaping upwards, reflecting it back into the room. In winter, it was a warm cap for the house. Second, the turf protected the fragile layer of birch bark from mechanical damage, and, importantly, from direct sunlight, which could dry it out and make it brittle. The earth served as a strong shell for the waterproofing layer. Thirdly, this layer was alive. Over time, grass began to grow on the roof, turning it into a green lawn. The roots of this grass further bonded the turf blocks together, creating a single, durable, and monolithic covering. The house literally grew into the surrounding landscape. The Vikings lived in a climate where snow could lie for 6 to 8 months of the year. And while heavy snowfall is a problem for modern humans, for the Scandinavians it was another element of their complex survival system. They did not fight the snow, but used it as a free and incredibly effective insulator. The very design of the house was intended to catch snow. Long sloping roofs, smoothly transitioning into thick turf walls, had no sharp corners. When it began to snow, the wind piled up huge drifts that accumulated against the walls of the house and on the roof. The house gradually disappeared under a deep blanket of snow. The drifts against the walls could reach the roof, completely covering the earthen walls. From the outside, the settlement turned into a group of hills, from which only smoke vents and entrances to vestibules were visible. The Vikings were in no hurry to dig their houses out from under this blanket of snow. They understood perfectly well that snow is one of the best natural insulators. The secret of snow lies in the air, trapped between the snowflakes. This immobile air prevents heat from escaping and cold from penetrating inside. It worked on the same principle as an Eskimo igloo. A layer of compacted snow 1 meter thick or more created an additional thermal cocoon around the house. This cocoon completely sealed the dwelling, closing the last gaps through which the wind could penetrate. Under this snow armor, the temperature at the surface of the earthen walls of the house remained stable, around 0 degrees, even when a blizzard raged outside and the temperature dropped to 30 degrees below zero. The snow acted as a buffer, smoothing out sharp temperature changes and protecting the turf from deep freezing. Thus, the thermal protection of the house was multi-layered. The first line of defense was the wooden frame. The second was thick walls and a turf roof. The third, outer line of defense was a thick layer of snow. This entire system worked together to keep the heat from the hearth and livestock inside. What was life like inside this warm but dark and smoky ark? The interior layout of the longhouse was as rational as its exterior design. The entire space was organized for maximum convenience and heat retention. The main element of the interior was benches, or pall. Along both long walls, from the barn to the end wall, there were wide raised platforms. They were made of wood and covered with boards. These platforms were the main living area. People sat on them during the day, worked on them, and slept on them at night.
It is good to be raised above the cold earth.
This layout was not chosen by chance. The floor in the house was earthen and cold. The coldest air always sinks down. By raising the living area half a meter above the floor level, the Vikings escaped the discomfort zone. It was much warmer at the level of the benches. The space between the benches was occupied by an earthen floor and a long hearth in the center. This is where people walked, cooked food, and tended the fire. All life took place on two levels, the working passage below and the living decks on the sides. This layout resembled the interior of a ship. At night, the family would sleep on these benches, using skins and woolen blankets. People often slept in their everyday clothes to stay warmer. Slaves and servants could sleep on the floor by the hearth, or even in the utility area, closer to the livestock. Winter days were short, and there were no windows in the house. The only source of light was the hearth, and, possibly, a small smoke hole in the roof. Therefore, most of the time, the house was in semi-darkness. It took time for the eyes to adjust to this darkness. The longhouse was the center of life, but it was not the only building in the settlement. For some activities, especially those involving fire or requiring privacy, separate small buildings were constructed. And in their construction, the Vikings also applied their knowledge of heat conservation. One of the most important buildings was the smithy. Keeping a forge inside a dwelling full of dry wood, straw, and dozens of people was too dangerous. The risk of fire was enormous. Therefore, smithies were always built at a safe distance from the main dwelling. In order to be able to work in the smithy in winter, it was often built according to the Grubenhaus principle, or semi-dugout. The building was half or even completely dug into the ground. The walls were formed by the soil itself, which was covered with boards. The roof was low and often covered with turf. Such a pit retained heat very well. Firstly, it was protected from the wind. Secondly, it used geothermal heat. At a depth of 1 meter, the ground does not freeze as much as on the surface. The forge itself provided enough heat to warm this small underground room. Other workshops were often built using the same principle of semi-dugouts. For example, weaving workshops, where it was necessary to maintain a certain level of humidity for working with wool, or carpentry workshops. Digging into the ground was a universal way to create a stable microclimate. In some settlements, traces of small baths or steam rooms have also been found. These structures were similar to smithies, small, often dug into the ground, with a massive hearth covered with stones. The stones were heated and then doused with water to produce steam. These small buildings complemented the settlement's heating system. The longhouse served as a warm base for living and sleeping, while specialized underground workshops allowed craft activities to continue without disrupting the safety and thermal balance of the main dwelling. We can see that the Viking longhouse was a true marvel of engineering. It was not just a building, but a complex, integrated system where each element worked toward a common goal, preserving life in the Arctic winter. Thick turf walls, a living roof, heat from livestock, clever smoke management, and the use of snow as insulation were all part of a unified strategy. What other secrets of the Viking era would you like to uncover? Perhaps you are interested in their shipbuilding, weapons, or mythology. Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new journeys into the past.